Good morning, everyone. And good morning to our virtual audience. We are thrilled you could join us. For those who are here in the audience today, we are live streaming this event to the World Wide Web, so I hope you did your hair and all that stuff. You know? My name is Julie Miles, and I'm the associate producer of the Meighen Forum. Ann-Marie MacDonald's new play, Hamlet 911, connects adults with youth in a brilliant, heart-wrenching story full of contemplation, dilemma, and discovery. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission's call to action number 66 recognizes the need for adults and youth to come together to establish multi-year funding for community-based youth organizations to deliver programs on reconciliation and establish a national network to share information and best practices. In acknowledging the ancestral guardians of this land and its waterways, the Anishinaabe, the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, the Wendat, and the Attawandarong, we also make a commitment to continue to support all 94 calls to action to hope for generations to come. Forgot my reading glasses. Nice. I'm good. So a few housekeeping notes before we get started. We will be taking questions from our audience today, and for those here in Lazaridis Hall, our ushers will circulate with note cards for you to clearly write down your questions, and later during the conversation, the ushers will come by and collect them. And for those in our virtual audience, we would love to hear from you as well. So if you have a question, please write it in the chat, and we'll get to it, and we'll get it to the stage in a timely manner. So I'm going to keep my introductions of our guests today short and sweet so we can get to all the good parts. Rachel Giese is an award-winning journalist, author, and deputy national editor at the Globe and Mail. Her book, Boys, What It Means to Become a Man, was a Canadian bestseller and won the Writers' Trust of Canada Shaughnessy Cohen Prize for Political Writing. Ann-Marie MacDonald is an internationally award-winning author, actor, and playwright. In 2019, she was made an Officer of the Order of Canada for her contributions to the arts and her activism and advocacy of LGBTQ+ rights. And so without further ado, please welcome Rachel Giese and Ann-Marie MacDonald.
Thank you so much, Julian. Hello, everyone. Thanks so much for coming out this morning. And I'm going to be reading my notes off my phone, so I'm not texting during this conversation. But I'd ask that everyone make sure that your phones are turned off during the conversation. It's so lovely to see you, Ann-Marie.
Likewise, Rachel.
Yeah, and we were meant to have this conversation 2 years ago.
Yeah.
And the pandemic happened, and so here we are 2 years later. So I wanted to start by asking you about how you and your family fared over the last 2 years. I know for a lot of writers and a lot of artists, going into isolation was not perhaps an unfamiliar experience, but it also meant, not having the play premiere 2 years ago, opportunities for travel, for fellowships, those sorts of things. So how has it been for you over the last 2 years?
Wow, everybody has their unlooked for, unexpected pandemic saga. And time has changed for us, I think, just as a species. Just anecdotally, and probably many of you can relate to this. I go, oh yeah, that was a couple of years. No, that was 4 years ago, because I didn't count the pandemic. And I go, oh, when did we last see each other? Oh, right, 2 years. But I've mentally adjusted such that, it's just a few months ago. No. So I feel that the time-space continuum has done something. The kind of those bendy mirrors, or like a funhouse midsummer, there's a bend in the time-space continuum, and I'm still trying to understand chronologically how I fit into it. Yes, we were supposed to have been here 2 years ago, and I'm so grateful that there is a season this year and that people have come out in person. It's huge. It's an act of faith, I think, and of generosity that we're still gathering to tell each other's stories in person. And the web. Where's the camera? Is that it? And everybody up there. It's very moving, and I'm really grateful to be here. I was working on a novel the whole time, and I was doing rewrites for Hamlet 911. So there's a degree of isolation, as Rachel mentioned, that is inherent to any literary pursuit. So in that way, things didn't change for me in terms of working, but then I'd emerge into, more isolation, right? There was that kind of hush everywhere. We felt very lucky as a family. We had the quote-unquote pandemic silver lining of unexpected together time with our children, who are now 17 and 19. So, older teenagers getting into young adulthood, a really precious time. I'm very grateful that we had that extra time. Everything, just the uncertainty and having to rest in that. I also became quite ill, in fact, during the pandemic. I didn't have, as a friend of mine's older mom says, the COVID. Didn't have the COVID.
You didn't have the COVID?
I never had the COVID, but I did develop a serious autoimmune inflammatory disorder, and that was very painful. So I was then very, very limited, but it seemed to coincide, the worst of it coincided with the 2 years of the pandemic, so I couldn't go anywhere or do anything, but then neither was anyone else. So there was that sense of an opportunity of actually going perhaps a little bit deeper into my family and into the more kind of the longer arcs, the deeper things, having the opportunity to be less distracted by things, and to really renew my focus and my sense of priorities. I'm grateful for that, and I'm also grateful to be much, much better.
Yeah, and I'm glad. I'm grateful for that too. Yeah. It's interesting because I think in your work you've never been a writer who's afraid to go into the basement or the dark reaches of the attic. So in terms of navigating illness in a pandemic, did you find that there were either even further depths to plumb and go into, sort of further corners? And
yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And glad to be out of those corners.
Very glad. And I
do be out in the sunshine again.
Truly, yeah. Because I do voluntarily enter those places, and I'm at a place in my own life and career now where I go, I think I might be going to different places now in my, the quote unquote third act. If if I'm lucky enough to have a nice chunky third act, I would like to go in some different directions. But I've always gone down into the underworld, and I've always said, okay, I need to be able to come down here. I need to find out some truth that we can all share, and I need to come back with it in a narrative form that is communicable. And that is a hard journey. And then I did do it. I literally did do it personally with my health. And I thought, well, while I'm down here, and I have to believe I'm going to come back, what is it that I can learn, and what can I remember, and what can I bring back that I will be true to if I'm lucky enough to regain my wellness, right? And so, and I also consider myself a comedian. So I feel like my writing is comedic, which might seem like a strange thing to claim, but I always think if there's somebody alive at the end of the story to tell the tale, then that's a comedy.
That's the perfect definition. And I feel like that's a great segue to talking about the work here in Stratford, the work that was meant to premiere 2 years ago, Hamlet 911. Feel free to jump in if I'm not describing it properly, and I don't know if many people had a chance to see it. It's just now in previews. But it's the story of an actor named Guinness Menzies, who is a television actor who's been cast as Hamlet in Stratford. And it's about how he is navigating his own relationship with his father. It's about the people around him who have to navigate around him and his ego and his entitlement in that place. And it's about also the bigger themes of succession and inclusion. Who gets to own stories and claim them, and who gets to tell stories. Is that a fair enough description?
That's beautiful, yes. Yeah.
So could you talk a bit about the genesis of this? This is not the first time you've taken on Shakespeare. You did that with Good Night, Desdemona, Good Morning, Juliet. So what was your relationship with Hamlet and with the works of Shakespeare, and what led you to decide to tinker with this particular play?
Well, my wife, Elisa Palmer, who is the director, of the production, Hamlet 911, had an idea. Gosh, it was like at least 10 years ago. And it was inspired by a dinner party that she had attended. She was at the Stratford Festival at the time, and there was a dinner party that was that included several directors. It was a director's dinner party, and directors don't usually hang out together in groups, right? They're kind of lone wolves. They're not like pack animals,
Right.
but there they all were, like a dinner, wine-soaked, anecdote-filled evening, and I think it was mostly men and maybe like 2 or 3 women. And then at a certain point, the conversation turned to Shakespeare, and all the men started talking about their Hamlets.
Right.
And they all had a couple of Hamlets. They'd either played Hamlet, they directed it a couple of times. None of the women had a Hamlet. So Lisa thought, I'm going to get a Hamlet. I'm going to get my Hamlet. And so she told me about this kernel of an idea and about her relationship to Hamlet, the play, Hamlet, the character. And I said, I wouldn't mind toying with that a little bit too. And so she has a small company called Vita Brevis, which, aptly, life is short. And she came to the Stratford Festival, and at the time, it was in Des's time, and said, hey, I've got this idea, I want to take on Hamlet, and Ann-Marie is interested. And so the Stratford Festival has supported the project from the very beginning, and it's taken its time, and it's taken its journeys, and it has had a long gestational arc. And part of that is something that is not new to me. I do think that projects benefit. I usually have something going on in tandem so that they'll come to fruition at different times, but they do tend to benefit from a long gestational arc where a lot of work gets done in the unconscious mind. The pandemic has meant that everything has surfaced at the same time. I have Hamlet 911, I have a book, and then Elisa will direct the stage adaptation of Fall on Your Knees that she's been working on as well for 10 years. So all of these, that's another pandemic pile-up thing.
Right.
Where here it all is. But that said, also the fact that our children are older, I think means that I'm probably going to work faster from now on. But it was truly a really challenging process to really interrogate the themes and to really come face to face with what is succession, what is reconciliation, what do we owe the next generation. Just because somebody is my biological child or even a child in my family should and does make no difference to the debt that I owe them or to the responsibility that I have for them. And this phrase kept echoing in my mind, which was, they are all our children. And this is something that has been in my mind and my heart for years now, and I started to really, really feel the reverberative echoes of truth and reconciliation, of missing and murdered women and others. There was also the tragic case of, and I don't even like to mention it because I don't want to distress her loved ones, but the young girl, Amanda Todd, who was hounded to her death and is now in the news again because the perpetrator is, that all of that is happening. That was also profoundly affected me as a parent. And her eloquence, her silent eloquence when she held up those sheets of paper to tell what had happened to her on YouTube, that seared me. And I thought, I have to be true to something. Kids are suffering, and I have to listen, and I have to be true to something that is being expressed right now. And it's not an accident that my children are of an age to have paralleled that experience, and they're the first experience that we have socially of internet predation, for example, not to mention distraction, et cetera. It's in all the great things, but it's another portal. And I thought there's something there. So the character of Jeremy, who stumbles into a very dark place in the internet, and the degree to which his connection with storytellers and with theater is redemptive. And how do you make those connections? And how, if you are Guinness, for example, big man on campus, his dad was a lion of the theater, Guinness will never measure up. He's a straight white male, all of this jazz. I wanted to put him through the paces. It's almost a Scrooge-like story, as one young person pointed out the other day. I did a seminar. She said, "Is that anything like the Christmas Carol?" I said, "Yeah, always in everything I write. Thank you." But yes, he has an opportunity to literally go into the underworld. His guide is Yorick, and which I always thought was that was the major tragedy of Hamlet, is that the jester is dead before the play begins. No wonder everything went to hell in a handcart. The comedian is gone. He's left the building. So I brought him back. He's a character. He guides our hero through the underworld. Our hero has to confront a whole lot of things about his privilege and his pain and his transgressions, and do at least one good thing for which he'll get no thanks or acknowledgement, and change the world in a little bit of a way. He knows about it. He knows he's changed. I don't know if everybody else will ever notice. But that also, for me, is a spirit of reconciliation and of storytelling and of the circles of storytelling and inclusion. And as Ophelia says, we know what we are, but know not what we may be. And I think that's, in the midst of tragedy, a very hopeful sentiment. So that's what I try to bring and say, let's make the circles bigger. Let's keep connecting with each other. Let's not, if we can at all avoid it, let's not kick anyone out. Let's make our world more complex and more welcoming and more enlightened and more inclusive. That's,
And I wanted to dig into some of that a bit more because I think one of the things, and I had I was able to read the script 2 years ago, and then, you had an opportunity, and I want to talk about that as well, to make some revisions. The 2 years of the play being put on hold allowed you to go back and respond. And one of the I think one of the major changes is the inclusion of more of the young people in the story. And I was thinking about this because, again, I know that you have teenage daughters, and the character of if for those who haven't seen it, there are students who have come to see the play. They've come to see this production of Hamlet, and they have questions. And Jeremy is a young man who has questions for Guinness, and they're looking for adults to be accountable, to answer their questions, to explain to them why the world is the way that it is. And I'm wondering, was that reflecting what you were hearing from your daughters, their friends, other young people? So in adding that, and I think especially during the pandemic, when you had more time, and I have a teenage son as well, and so I also had more time with him, and I also had the experience of getting to know him in a way that I might not have had we not been thrown together at a time when kids are typically out, typically fleeing the house. So what were you hearing from your children and their friends and the other young people? Like, what were you hearing when you were listening over the last couple of years?
I was hearing some classic things about the importance of friendship, the fear of the future, the uncertainty, the importance of feeling connected, and the anguish when there is a sense that they're not connected for whatever reason to one another. There is I do pick up on a sense of real acute uncertainty about our world, pandemic, climate crisis, and at a certain point you can't soothe that away, right? I do say it is inherent in our species to predict that the world will end. I remember when I was a little kid, every second cartoon in Time magazine featured a guy with a sandwich board. The world will end tomorrow. Yeah. Right. Yeah. So there is that, but You can't, there are some things you can't soften, right? Yeah, that's a fact. But can we do something about it? Is it the great work of your time? Yes. And there have been other epochs with other great challenges, and this is this one. And don't let anybody tell you that you can't overcome it and that we can't overcome it. That is that's that kind of learned helplessness, et cetera, et cetera. We have no time for that, right? But that uncertainty also coupled with what am I going to do with the rest of my life? What are my peers doing? Everybody else seems to know what they're doing, and I'm the only one who doesn't know. And I say, well, you know what? You're not the only one who doesn't know. So to have the privilege of actually being in that conversation, and to see them going to school and in their room and then coming down from school into the kitchen. It was like they couldn't just sort of be out with each other. Right? That was tough. So there was that isolation, but at the same time, I am really grateful for that extra time because we had a really nice time together. You know, it's great. Of course, you love your children, but you're really lucky when you like them too. And they're really likable, they're fantastic people. But I did pick up from them and their friends that sense of uncertainty about the world, and yeah, I even remember my eldest daughter back in the January of 2020 saying, "There's a flu in Wuhan, and I'm really worried about it." And I said, "Oh, don't worry about it. There's always a new flu." No, this is different. I said, "No, it's not." And she said, "No, I have friends. I have friends whose families live in Wuhan, and they're just coming back from holidays, and they're telling me." And I went, "Right, the world is different. Our children have friends from all over the world. It's a smaller world." And you know, that was a case of me going, "Oh, don't worry." Well, yeah, she was right about it. Yeah. So it's hard to see your kids having more of a sense of the impending doom of the pandemic than I had.
Yeah.
You know.
Well, and I think
I couldn't protect them from it, but you know.
Yeah, and I think it's it's interesting because I was a kid in the 80s and remember the kind of the doomsday clock being hovering just around midnight and the real fear of nuclear war, and so growing up underneath that cloud. Exactly. But I do think it is different, and I think it's sort of I think it's exactly what you spoke about, is the access that young people have to information, often misinformation, because the world is smaller, because of their access to. I mean, I think social media is both a good thing and a bad thing. Yeah. But I think what I found with my son too is also. The amount of information that he had access to that I couldn't help him filter or understand in some ways. That I think was that sort of character. That was a different characteristic of this particular moment and the particular fear that young people have in this generation.
That is absolutely a qualitative difference. Yeah. Another thing that came home to us, and because I feel very privileged to live with teenagers, is that friends who are looking at their gender identification, their sex, their sexuality, the relationship among those things, and it becoming very, very conversant. Now, both my children, I will speak for them. That's dangerous to speak for your children.
Because they can watch this. They
can watch this. Oh, no. But we are a same-sex couple. We are married. Our children have grown up going to gay pride, and it's normal for them, right? They are from a queer culture heritage. They have queer heritage, if I can put it that way, right? And so I think, and it's not like we're talking about politics and how to be a correct, human being, and it's not like that at all, but it just is the air they breathe. And so I have found that it's a happy thing that I think some of their friends who might not otherwise feel that comfortable do find a level of comfort, because they just go, "Okay, well, yeah, I'll call you who are you? What do you want me to, you've changed your name, that's fine, I still love you." All of those things, that's been very present. That's just a kitchen table kind of thing for us, right? So.
And like a lot of that again comes through in Hamlet 911, because there are these characters like Guinness's father Rex, who is a completely unapologetic misogynist, a predator, and someone who just does not believe that the world should change.
Yes, and also I think he is completely beloved, right? He is Big Daddy. Yeah. And who doesn't want to see him do Shakespeare and bring down the gods, right? And invoke it all. And so here's the thing, that he's got this speech where he invokes the spirit of theater, and he tells us why storytelling is important, and he has this big inclusive reach, and come into the circle, and we're going to do the most sacred, precious thing of all, which is we're going to tell stories here. And he has that speech, and Scott Wentworth does it beautifully. And then he undercuts it with a big complaint about, what's this, women playing men, and he has this quote, this in a motley company of United Nations feel-goodery. And I love pronouns and rainbows and unicorns. And of course it's funny, and it is problematic. But he has said something really true just before that. And getting back to the whole idea of succession, right? Guinness is there with the example of his father being, a sexist guy who slept with all his Juliets, cheated on his wife, etc. Guinness is a better man, but can never measure up in his father's eyes, right? Just as young Jeremy can't measure up in his stepfather's eyes, and all the other lost little kids. And I always think about what I went through as a much younger person when I came out to my parents, and it was really bad for a while. Ultimately, it was, my parents are very loving, wonderful people, but there was a very bad patch. And I remember them saying, "You've taken all the values with which we raised you, and you have thrown them away, and you've turned your back." And I said, "No, I've taken all the values, and I'm living them. You just don't recognize it." And I think that was my way of, how Jacob wrests a blessing from his father in the Bible? It's like, I know you don't want to give me your blessing, but I need it, and I'm going to take it. I'm going to claim those values. I'm going to say, "Yes, Rex, what you told us was important. It is important, and it's mine now, and I'm taking it forward," which is why there's a chorus of young people, very diverse, inclusive group of young people who then echo his words at the end, because you go, "You know what, Big Daddy? You're full of shit in some ways, but you have the truth, and I'll take that truth because it belongs to all of us, and I will carry it forward, and I will tell my own stories through it, and they will be those ongoing values." So I think that's where succession is. If they're not wanting to open the door and give it to you, you just got to go in there and get it and take it, get the sacred fire, carry it forward. Sometimes no one's going to give it to you.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah. And I know that in having a conversation with you and Elisa a little while back on the phone, both of you talked about how the process of working on the play, of going through rehearsals, kind of embodied these very questions of succession and expanding the circle. That the play itself is about how do we take this sacred act of telling stories, and how do we ensure that the circle expands? How do we keep people in the circle as much as possible, but ensure that the circle has all of the voices and the perspectives, that people feel like they can take the old stories, reclaim them, remake them. So can you talk a bit about what the process of casting the play, rehearsing, how you sort of brought some of that thinking into the making of Hamlet 911 itself?
Well, having a diverse company was extraordinarily important and has been from the very beginning for us. And in the meantime, over this kind of 10-year arc, the Stratford Festival has also evolved in that regard. So in a way, we kind of it's kind of good timing, right? Because from a time and place where it was like, we need to have diverse actors. We have to have a company that looks like our country, right? And then some. And that doesn't just mean one visible minority person from each category. That means true diversity and inclusion. And that was something that was more difficult at first and is way easier now, I'm very happy to say. But it was always a priority.
Yeah. And did you have, you talked about Stratford being on board, because the play is set at Stratford. Yeah. And you are telling some uncomfortable truths about theater. And I'm wondering, and you, a playwright, you're also an actor, how have you grappled with the Rexes and the Guinnesses in your career? Have you had to grapple with those characters?
Grappled.
You've grappled.
I've grappled. I'm 63 years old. This is my first time at the Stratford Festival. I rest my handbag. Yeah, so yes, right? I did grapple. I graduated from National Theatre School in 1980 from the acting program. And of course, now my wife, Elisa Palmer, is the artistic director of National Theatre School. If you told me back then in 1980 that I would end up being married to the artistic director one day, I'd say, but I think I'm gay. How's that going to work?
Yeah, how could I possibly?
Yeah, so things change, right? And like history surprises us sometimes in very good ways. But yes, one of the instructors I had at NTS was a lovely man named Clifford Williams. There are a couple, so let's not get confused. But my Clifford Williams was British, and he used to like to say, "Don't worry, darling, it will all come together when you get the frockery and the hats." So he was very old school at a time which was very, 1980, late 70s, very infused with a kind of a 60s thing. Like, we're just going to be very 60s about everything. I mean, I hated that aspect of it. I wanted to have a regimented theater school, basically run the way Julie Andrews runs The Family in The Sound of Music. I didn't want 60s freedom. Oh, no, please, let's have some rigor. So, but there were, thankfully, some coaches and teachers who really did have rigor. Clifford had, I can't call it rigor, really, but he did have some insight. And I remember in my exit interview, he said, "Darling, you're essentially a comedian, and you're not going to, you're not really going to be able to work until you're 35. So in the meantime, you're a character actress. That's what she said. You're a character actress, darling, and you won't really work significantly until you're over 35. So in the meantime, you've got to learn how to walk in heels and practice getting in and out of a car in a tight skirt." And for God's sake, walk in heels. I was wearing construction boots. And I thought, you know what, Clifford, he's right. I can't work in this world unless I'm the right kind of girl. And you could tell it's still a little bit fire alive in me there when I think about those days. I thought, no. I did actually have quite a good career doing television. I played lots of nice girls next door, and I had long hair, but I soon came out, and even after I came out, which was a difficult thing to do at that time, I still played girls next door, and I still looked like everybody's straight best friend and cousin, and that was fine. That helped me to work, but I soon realized that. I remember watching a play with some brilliant actors in it, and I was like 21 years old, and I thought, those women are at the pinnacle of their career. Is that where I want to be? And in a crestfallen moment, I realized, no, I'm actually not on an acting path. I wish I wanted that. I thought I wanted that. And I started working collectively, and I started doing devised theater, as they call it now. But we made collective creations, working independently, creating shows with other people, producing them, directing them, teching them. We all did all the jobs. And that was another great education that I got. Out of that, I started to write plays. Goodnight Desdemona, Good Morning Juliet was the first solo-authored play, although everything you do in theater is collaborative. So it's not like I was in a garret and it came out like, oh, and here it is. No, it always goes through workshops and changes. And I think that's how Shakespeare wrote, too, actually. We can get onto that later if you want.
Yeah.
My theory.
Yes, please.
But I learned so much then. And so that was the first play that I wrote knowing I would not be in it. And I learned a huge amount just by taking responsibility for the arcs of all those characters. And I thought, every role needs to be one that I would love to play, that an actor would love to play. Every role needs to be a gift to the actor. So I think I brought that from my acting experience. And, I continued to act and do all these things, but more and more I went into writing and creation. But a lot of that was spurred by the fact that, okay, I don't even want to do most of these roles. So what am I going to do about it? I guess I'm going to start writing. And I also didn't want to have to be anybody's sweetheart or darling. It was bad enough. I couldn't avoid it. I mean, until I was about 40, I felt like going down the street was still just a freaking gauntlet. And now, I love being older. I love being a person. I mean, and I've always gotten along well with guys. And now I just get to be a person. I get to talk to guys in the parking lot at Canadian Tire. And I'm just a person. And I go, listen, I've always liked you, and I'm so glad that you're not harassing me anymore, and don't harass anyone else. And hopefully life has changed. But really, there was enough to grapple with. And yeah, I was on fire as a feminist. I would still consider myself to be a feminist, which is just to say I'm a human being with an inclusive worldview. That's what it means to me. And with some very conscious thinking about how to make the world more egalitarian for everybody. Regardless, right, of gender, etc. So yeah, I was on fire with that, and that fueled me, and it still fuels me, because I still do feel that sexism is still the air we breathe and the water we swim in, regardless of our gender. But I still do see a degree of misogyny, which stealthily it gets disguised as other things. You know, behind all kinds. Sometimes it's even stealthily behind the veil of equality, diversity, and inclusion, except for the women, right? Sometimes that will come in, where you'll get you go, well, women still need to be included. We still have something to offer. We still need to keep our embrace open so that we don't get into this thing of, the guilty white liberal flavor of the month group. That doesn't help anyone. It makes the world smaller. It divides us and it conquers us instead of keeping us understanding that we are one another's allies, all of us, regardless of how we identify, right?
So how do you then break that down or make that change? If it's not like thinking about creating new models, thinking about, you talked earlier about not casting people out of the circle. Sometimes maybe they can't stay in the circle, but for you in terms of whether it's working on a play, whether it's thinking about authorship in a different kind of way, and I do want to ask you your theory about Shakespeare, but even thinking about, and I think it's like bringing that spirit to thinking, well, there's no, most things are not sort of one single genius, one single author. So how do you then, or what would you like to see in terms of enlarging the circle, in terms of the calls for change that people are asking for, to see art more reflective of a variety of realities, to see leadership in organizations shift?
Well, I think that you've I think you've identified it when you say leadership, right? Because we need leadership, and we need courageous leadership, and we need to empower more and more people to be in positions of leadership, right? And that's when the world really changes. I find it really exciting that there's more and more young people who are interested in that, right? And there's growing pains and friction and all of that, but I think it's a very exciting time, right?
Yeah.
And I think it is about leadership, and it is about power, and that's another thing too. Like when you're talking about younger people. You give them some power and responsibility, and they learn how to use that power and that responsibility, and usually that means being responsible for others, and that's a big thing, right? When you have to think about the well-being of the people that you are leading and organizing, what is leadership, right? It's the opposite of control, right? It's all, for me, it's always about the well-being and the identification. Where are we going? How can we all go there together? How can all these voices be heard? How can and I'm not a leader, so I can only talk about it. I really am not, but I find it fascinating.
Yeah. And so you had all of these ideas and questions, and then you had, Elisa coming to you and saying, like, I don't have a Hamlet, I want a Hamlet. So in terms of thinking about how to make some of the frame of Hamlet to hold all these ideas, what was it like to revisit that text and then think about, how do I get at these questions about succession, about expanding the circle, about some questions about what we owe to future generations, how we claim the old stories? How was it to take all of those ideas and then say, I'm going to rest them somehow in Hamlet, I'm going to connect them?
It was so challenging. It was really, really, really hard, because there's so much in Hamlet, and it's not a comedy. And that was really hard, because I thought, what am I doing here? Oh, and it's really the guy's play, right?
Right.
Also, I kind of find Hamlet a little bit annoying too.
Yeah.
Right? So I thought, how am I gonna do this? What are the themes? What are the personalities? That's why in the show there's a dumb show of Hamlet, where you just basically see him kill all kinds of people and be quite violent with a lot of people. He's very active. He's very violent. He is not the morose. And if you've seen Amaka do their Hamlet, I mean, they're amazing, right? It's just they're incredible.
Yeah, kinetic, like
Yeah. That's kind of like more. That's what I think of as Hamlet, right? So that's very exciting to see them do that in that lovely production. But I thought, okay, there's entitlement and the kind of depression that hits you when you know that you have unearned power. And I also think that that is a form of oppression, and I've seen that especially not exclusively, but especially with some younger men, where it's like, I've got this power. I don't know if I earned it. I don't know if people respect me. I'm supposed to live up to something that I don't even know I believe in anymore. What is expected of me? What are the good fights? Who are the allies? And will I make a fool of myself if I don't just try to succeed on, for example, my father's terms or the patriarchal terms? Will I look like an idiot? And for me, thematically, I always think that the protagonists need to go on for me, the hero's journey is very much like the fool's journey, where you need to be curious, and curiosity implies a form of humility. Humility is inherent in the commitment to listening, to learning, and looking like a fool, which is the place where the best learning happens. So I thought I'll take one of these men who is, and society is not really sympathizing with him I love Guinness. I sympathize with him enormously, and I have a lot in common with him. So I'll take this guy and put him through his paces, and he'll get to figure out what's actually important to him. And meanwhile, there's a 14-year-old boy whose parents aren't connected with him, and whose dad has also died, who has an unsympathetic stepfather. How can this actor, who was too busy to answer the email from this 14-year-old boy, how can they meet? How can he change that kid's life for the better without even getting any credit for it in the upper world? Because, of course, his journey is in some kind of liminal space between our conscious world and the underworld. And that's where a whole lot of things happen, I think. And that's always a narrative opportunity for me. But yeah, I mean, that and I love all my characters. You know, people say, "Oh, do you love your bad characters?" I go, I can't write them if I don't love them. People talk about, for example, people will ask me about Fall on Your Knees and the character of James, and I mention that because I think some people may have read that book. Or if you're here, you probably maybe.
A couple people may have read that book.
Maybe, yeah, because a lot of people read it. And I go, yes, of course I love him.
Yeah.
I write out of love and out of compassion. And otherwise, I couldn't possibly spend time behind those eyes and inside that heart. So,
well, I know you've also said that, when people ask the question about, whether work is autobiographical, and I know that you've often said, I don't know if this is still true for you, that of course it is, that as the author of something, of course you're putting something of yourself. And you mentioned that you feel like you have a lot in common with Guinness. So I'm assuming that even in the bad characters, or the characters who do bad things, are there elements of you in those characters? Are you bringing parts of the self into all the characters you write?
I think so, and that's a beautifully put. Thank you for framing the question in that way, because people do want to know, and I want to know, but I do think that part of my job as a writer of fiction and drama, I am a channel, right? I am a filter for these various points of view, so they all filter through me, and they're going to bear the signs and traces of my own experience. And when I was a kid, I remember being told, maybe in grade 5, write a composition, now write what you know. And my heart would sink. why would I don't know anything. And even now, write what you know. No, I want to write what I can imagine. I need the what if, and that is the portal through which various voices and points of view can filter through me, right? And yes, so absolutely, everything is autobiographical. Even Rex, the problematic Rex, I love him and his speech about what it means to tell stories with a live audience. That was the first piece of text that I wrote, and I remember I was here in Stratford, in December. No offense, it's lovely in December. I'm just saying.
But you mean Omicron December?
Not even.
Not even.
Before that, and the reason I go, oh my goodness, is because my association with Stratford as a theater artist is, it's in the, in the full flower of summer. No, I was in the darkness of a cold, wet winter writing by myself, and which is basically my life. It was kind of, there was a sense of the place being deserted. But those words came to me about what it means, and that the sacred fire and what that is, and how we share it, and how it never goes out, and how it belongs to all of us. And those were the first words where I understood. I thought, okay, I have a way into this script. I have a way into this story. And of course, those are the words spoken by Rex, Big Daddy.
Right.
And those are the words spoken by his inheritors, whether or not he realizes these are his heirs. These young people of whom he is dismissive and mistrustful and afraid. He's afraid of them. They are his heirs. They do not look like him. They do not identify the way he does. But we are his heirs.
Yeah. You mentioned earlier, some of the ways in which you kind of playfully tinkered with Hamlet in having Yorick not die, or Yorick show up as a spirit,
come back from the dead. He's a ghost.
Yes, he's a ghost, but to have more than just the skull, and also you kind of gave Ophelia more of her due, and I know that she was a character. In talking to you, that she was a character that you felt was not treated particularly well by Shakespeare. So can you talk a little bit about Ophelia and what you wanted to do with Ophelia in this, how you wanted to give her more of her due in Hamlet 9:1?
Of course, so much of this play developed in via conversations with Elisa, and she kept reminding me of Ophelia, and she was the one who said, look, Hamlet talks about killing himself, but Ophelia does it. And I went, oh, right. And so those words are in the mouth of young Jeremy, the 14-year-old who's supposed to go and see the matinee performance of Hamlet, Prince of Denmark. And then I started thinking about, and the Queen has the whole speech, and how come the Queen didn't help her? And then I realized, I'm not the first person to have asked that question, but I put that question in Jeremy's mouth. And why is it also that, all the men are very intrusive? Hamlet is very intrusive, and then her father sets her up to be eavesdropped upon by the king and her dad in an intimate scene where Hamlet is also being abusive toward her. And I often felt, especially growing up and as a young actor, that the Ophelia Flowers scene where she's, I came to view that often as a fetishization of female oppression, especially of young women, and of fetishizing the mental illness into which they plunge when they've been driven crazy by sexist, patriarchal cruelties and expectations, right? And I thought, why is that all so pretty? Why do we love watching her just get that flower, right? And it's not like that in this production either, right? I'll just say that. But that's what I grew up with, was the sense that a girl is never so pretty as when she's lost her mind. And there's all the pretty flowers. Yeah. And then her pretty clothes drag her down to the bottom. And I go, what's so pretty about that?
Yeah.
And why is that supposed to be definitively feminine? So I thought, I have to investigate that. Because you know what? Shakespeare didn't say she comes on all pretty, and would you please fetishize her victimhood? Nowhere are there any stage directions telling us to do that. So as with Goodnight Desdemona, Good Morning Juliet, I actually returned to the text. I thought, okay, what's actually written here? She's really saying stuff here. And at a certain point, she is so traumatized by what's happened that she can't string it together. She can only sing pieces of songs. And in our play, a young man takes on the role of Ophelia, and he has an angry kind of version of that speech where he says, I said it with flowers to save complication. But here's a translation, you're all fucking cowards. Anyway, spoiler. So I did want to look at Ophelia and give her her due. She's there in the text. I mean, it's there.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Before we move on, I'm conscious we're getting close to time. So if you haven't written a question, please do. We're going to open it up in just a few minutes. But I want to get at your theory about Shakespeare before I have some other questions for you. So I didn't want to lose the plot there. So tell us your grand theory of how Shakespeare.
Here's my grand theory.
Yeah.
And I learned this by doing Canadian theatre. And so many Canadian theatre artists will have the experience that I had and continue to have of workshopping new work. Whether you're coming together to devise it collectively or whether there's a writer who says, okay, I've got my director, my dramaturge, these are going to be my main editors, and a room full of actors who have worked with new work before, many of them quite often. And I'm going to get the feedback and just listening to it and then talking with the director, the dramaturge. That's how the play grows. I take all that information and then I go and I do rewrites. And I think we know that, what was it, Richard Burbage, right? He was the actor, manager, director. And we all know that Shakespeare used narrative templates, which would have been given to him by Burbage. And I think that Richard Burbage, as well as the actors, especially the comedic ones, or especially the tragedians, would say, listen, I need a bigger speech. I'm going to ad lib here. I need something funnier. And don't you think it'd be great if the army came on now? And I think that Shakespeare brought his literary gifts to bear on the dialogue, the soliloquies, all that beautiful writing is by Shakespeare. And yes, a middle-class son of a glove maker. Okay, nobles didn't write great stuff. They were too busy killing people or just having feasts or whatever they were doing, and the poor people didn't have time. But the emerging middle class at that time, that's where your artist comes from, really, from North York. Okay, let's just not be romantic about this, or let's be very romantic about it. So yeah, I think Shakespeare got a lot of help. I don't think he did his plots. I think that Richard Burbage helped, and I think the actors made demands and contributions narratively. And he wrote the juicy stuff. But I wouldn't be surprised if he could never really written a story to save his life, because he didn't have to.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And why do you think then the sort of single author or the single genius still has such traction?
Oh, well, I think, why do we love that? It still is some kind of Victorian, I guess, patriarchal, paternalistic way of looking at things. And by that, I don't just mean men. I hope I've made that clear by now. Well, it has to be. This is the great man theory. I don't know. There's always a collective. People are always in context. The great ideas have already all been thought of in many, many different ways, and sometimes they coalesce where everybody's ready to pay attention at the same time to the same thing and carry it forward. That's truly how things evolve and how ideas evolve. But it is a really simplistic way of looking at it that aggrandizes individuals, and I think, that's a really good question. Why do we adhere to this great individual theory? I think it's so inimical to everything that's healthy and creative about our society and about our social democracy and about individual creativity. I think it's an enemy of individual creativity. This idea that fully conceived and executed in my own brain. I don't fully conceive or execute anything in my own brain. It's always just as mind. I just had listen to this really interesting podcast about the extended mind, the extended identity. We are all each other, right? I am like at the headquarters of me, but the me is everybody here and out there. We actually do construct or participate in one another's identity and creativity, and I think that's how. I think that's actually reality.
Yeah. And is there a process for you when you're writing novels.
Oh, I just thought of it. It's all about ownership, isn't it?
It is, yes.
Yeah, it's all about private property. Okay, eat the rich, man. No, I didn't say that.
You
That
are
was a
bringing
joke.
back that 60s ethos from theater school. But when you write novels, do you try to replicate that process then? Because again, that is much more so obviously than theater, where you're writing something that then is going to be it's built in. The collaboration is built in because you're going to have directors and actors and set designers and lighting artists. So you're going to have all of that. When you're writing a novel, which is a more solitary creative process, how does that work for you then to bring in those other voices? Do you have a lot of readers of early manuscripts? Are you reading other people you really love? Are you taking in other art when you're writing a novel so that you are having those other voices and that other input?
I'm doing a lot of research. I'm reading a lot about whatever the subject matter is that I'm grappling with. And yes, I'll have a couple of readers, and I'll have an editor who will read it at various points. But it's true, it's less collaborative than theater. And I crave theater once I've spent a long arc of time working on fiction, and I do believe in private property. I like my house.
So we can't all come and
But you
live.
are welcome to knock on the door. Okay. And I would probably invite you in. Let's just be clear on that.
Yes, yes. The door is locked. We can knock. And there'll be the chain across it, and you'll peep out.
Yeah.
And then
No, but just that idea of ownership and ownership of people and the ownership of ideas and all of that. But yes, it is. It is less collaborative. So my collaborators will tend to be people either both dead and alive who have written books that are inspiring to me, and I'll read masses of nonfiction when I'm working on something like Fane, which is set in the late 19th century.
I wanted to a couple of things before we open it up to the audience Q&A. So I wanted to talk about the next project. So you mentioned that that Elisa, your wife Elisa Palmer, is participating with, I believe, Hannah Moscovich to adapt Fall on Your Knees for the stage next year. What was it like? I don't know how involved you have been, and I'm curious just to find out what is it like to revisit that novel more than 20 years later. And how involved have you been in the adaptation? Has it been something where you've said, it's yours, take it, run with it? Or have you enjoyed digging back into it yourself?
I've been lucky enough to function as a consultant on the process from the very beginning, which means that I've been able to read scripts, attend workshops, give feedback, and that's been a privileged position. But Elisa Palmer and Hannah Moscovich have done the lion's share. They've done the heavy lifting. And now there's an extraordinary and large company of actors and other artists and designers that have been brought into it, and it's very exciting. I saw part of the music workshop a few weeks ago in Toronto, and it was terrifically moving to see people up there and making music, because there's a lot of music in the book. And it was actually it was terrifically moving for me, and I think I'm old enough now to have had that experience of, oh, I'm far enough away from the time when I wrote it that I can actually be very moved by what I'm seeing. It didn't feel like, oh yeah, they've adapted my work. It was more like, wow, look what they're creating. And
did you get new things out of it? Like the fact that you had this distance from it. Were there new things about it that, because I think often with writers, there can be things that come out that are unconscious, that they're not even thinking about. They don't, maybe the idea is not fully fleshed out in their head, or you are at a stage in your life when something you may have wrote, it may land differently now at this stage in your life. Were there any of those discoveries for you?
Yeah, I almost wish you hadn't asked that, because that was what I wasn't answering just now.
Okay.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Yeah. I should have known.
Okay, you don't have to answer. But the door can stay shut.
Yeah. When I was there watching the music workshop, I actually was moved to tears because I realized, seeing the people up there embodying the various people in the book, I thought, oh, it just smote my heart. It went so deep, so young in my life. The racial, cultural divide and union in my own family. And to see it reflected and extrapolated to other communities as well that are represented in the play was as well. Yeah, I thought that goes right back to when I was a very small child and before I understood what those differences meant and what they were made of and how important they are and how deep they go. And that has a lot to do with, my mother coming from one culture and at the time considered race, and my father from another. Yeah, and so it's kind of beautifully reflected in the world of the show. And I was taken by surprise, right? Yeah.
The last thing I want to ask is about Fane before we open it up to the audience. I know that you had talked about your first 3 novels existing as a kind of trilogy, that they follow the arc of the 20th century, and go from a sort of a sweep of history with Fall on Your Knees to a very focused period of time in adult onset. I think it takes place just over a week, and they exist. And I had read in an interview you said that in your mind they exist as a kind of trilogy. You've now written your 4th novel, Fane. You've gone back to 19th century England and Scotland, and I'm wondering are you imagining this as a new sort of suite of stories, or is this a complete reset that Fane can exist on its own? And maybe you could talk a little bit. Fane's coming out in October, so maybe you could talk a little bit about the book.
I think it is a reset. I think that's well put, and it also reaches back to when I was a kid, and I've always loved, kid and younger person. I've always loved genre and different voices and different styles, and even pastiche. I delved into that on Goodnight Desdemona, Good Morning Juliet. But before that, as a kid, I was making up. I was writing newspapers, for 1851 Florida, small town. You could see the Mark Twain influence. But I would write and cartoons and little stories set in other places with very different voices that would be like C.S. Lewis, or then like Charlotte Bronte, and I'm going to write in that voice. I'm going to write in that voice now, and that was also a kind of a mimesis that drove my interest in performance. So the actual doing little stand-up impressions extrapolated into a kind of a literary thing of. That's a powerful voice. Look at the deliciousness of that language. Look at the rhythms that are used to tell that story, that serve that story so extraordinarily well. I'd like to do that. It's like, I want to play that musical instrument, or I want to play that kind of music. I want to play jazz over here, or some Bach over here. And wouldn't that be fun to have some facility with that? But with Fane, hey, one sec. It's 721 pages, and I thought I would just read a couple of chapters for you.
I mean, we've got time.
We have time.
We've got time. This crowd seems very agreeable. We've got time.
Anyway, so this is the book, and the reason I brought it was that I thought it might be fun to just read you. This is the first page.
Please do, yeah.
As a courtesy to those whose sole aim in opening this book be to obtain an answer to the question most often posed me, to wit, what is the secret of long life coupled with mental vigor? And to spare them fruitless perusal of these pages, herewith my answer. I am immortal. The latter assertion may cause the reader to question my claim to mental vigor. But where is the proof that I am mortal? I have not yet died. And if you are reading this, neither have you. Save the chapters for another time. But that's sort of like a different voice, right? So that was fun to find who that person was and what happened to them. And,
we've got some great questions.
Oh, please.
So I'm going to start asking questions, and I'll try to get to as many of them before we have to wrap. What advice would you have for young people, especially young queer people, who, like the teens in Hamlet 911, are questioning the world, but due to circumstance are being surrounded by outdated views?
Well, you really have to, as Paulina says in Shakespeare's Winter's Tale, it is required you do awake your faith. You're going to need it, the stamina, right? Dedicate yourself and join hands with one another and persist. And when we're talking about creativity, which I think is probably behind the question, and writing and creating, that requires a great deal of stamina. And I was saying writing is easy, finishing is hard. But to know that it's hard, there's going to be fun, right? There's a lot of energy. You're going to have a great time, especially if you're working with people that you like and your peers. There's a lot of excitement, a lot of energy. There will always come a time, probably around the middle, where it's like, your boat is scraping the bottom, and maybe there's fractiousness among the group that you all thought were so like-minded. It's important to have some structures in place to how do we talk to one another professionally, creatively. Let's have some fallback rules or conversational structures that we can depend on, because it's not if, it's when. And that creative differences do not necessarily imply personal shortcomings or flaws. Right? People can ask questions, people can disagree. That's also part of a creative process. And that's a healthy creative relationship. People talk about trying to create safe rooms, and I've courtesy of Elisa Palmer, who's done a lot of work in this regard at National Theatre School with young people and working creatively, and I coach a lot of them. We try for a healthy room. I don't know what's going to make anyone feel safe. I can't make people safe in this world, but I can contribute to creating a healthy room, a healthy context, and also to remember it's going to get tough. And you keep going forward. It is not easy. Art is not easy.
Thank you. The next one is, can you share how redemption and the redemptive work of life has become such an important part of your writing and creative process?
Redemption? The idea of redemption?
Yeah, the idea of redemption. How has it become such an important part of your writing and creative process?
Well, that's a lovely question, and it's a really lovely observation. I thank you for that, because that is very important to me. And I used to think that it was courtesy of my Catholic upbringing, because of the narrative of the 14 stations of that doesn't end. Well, it does end pretty well.
Yeah, I guess.
In a way,
if you stick around to the end,
you got to get right to the end.
You got to get right to the end.
But for me, the narrative of redemption is something that I grew up with, and I think it was also courtesy of my mother, who was the child of immigrants, and it was always like, yeah, you're in a tough place now, but we're going up there, and everybody has something to offer, and everybody has a gift. And, in my mother's terms, the best thing you can do in life, because, and in her terms, God has given everybody gifts. What you owe is to be true to your gifts and to express them. If you have a talent, you're not allowed to keep it to yourself. You are required to share it. And I think there is something redemptive about that sharing, about storytelling. As I say, for me, it's redemptive as long as we are telling each other the stories and, the what happened of it. So, yeah, I actually can't function in any other way. And I know other artists do to great effect, and great art is made out of a very different worldview. I cannot work there. Like, for me, that would be silence.
Just as there are powerful, hopeful plays about the events of 9/11, do you envision similar works about the pandemic? And this person also wanted to add thanks for all of your work. Do you imagine we're going to see a kind of flourishing of art about the events of the last 2 years?
That's such an interesting observation and question, too. I should think it will be inevitable. And I think that it will be kind of literal in the short term. People who are pretty much adults or at least young adults now, will write about it. But I think the real effect will be seen probably decades from now. I think of it as the rings of a tree. You know, you go, oh, there was a drought that year, right? Or something happened to the tree and then it recovered. And I think that the people who are much younger, people who are kids now, they've grown up, that's one of their tree rings is in there, and it's going to affect their worldview. It's going to affect everything they do. So whether they write or create or express themselves literally in response to the pandemic, I think the experience of the pandemic will ultimately become discernible, like a kind of like a wave that goes through an entire generation of expression. That again in the future, people will look back on and go, that was the pandemic cohort. Those people spent formative years during that period. And this is how it changed their worldview, whether it's a literal response or not, a concrete response or not.
Okay. You talk about widening the circle. What do you believe is the most progressive way for a director, producer, actor to handle material that specifically includes a narrow circle and or outgroup, i.e. Othello, Merchant of Venice, etc., for a contemporary audience? So how do you deal with works that have a narrowing of a circle of, I guess, of characters, or a narrow circle and or an outgroup? How do you, I don't know if the person, I don't want to put the person on the spot, but if the person wants to, right, we can,
expand on that a little bit.
Yeah.
I would love to know more about what you mean, sure.
Please.
Well, that's a great question, and I'm not a director, so I can't say what I would do because I don't think in those terms. But I would think you start by asking that question, and then you investigate who's going to be in this, right? Who's going to embody these characters? And there's so much a director can do to direct the audience's attention, right? In a way of telling that story. So yeah, it's predicated on this girl has married this outsider, and yes, it's predicated on racism. Of course, they didn't say that back then, but it is what it is, and it was what it was. Yeah, I don't know how you tackle it in terms of casting. What lens you want the audience? Sure, like you want the audience to understand it, because you're not doing a museum piece. We're doing the show now, with what we know now, with what's happening now. So how do you actually make sure that you've got all those lenses working and to be able to see the story for what it is? I think it reverberates that much more strongly now. The sting of it is even worse now than it ever was. So how do you contextualize that to say, I don't even know, like that's a great question for I'm sorry, I can't even answer. But that's the question that I would start with, right? And then I would start with, why are we doing this play? Right, that's the number one. Why are we doing this? And what do we want to say, and what do we want to show? Because it's right there, it's front and center, right, is the racism of it. Yeah, how do you tackle it? It's a good. Are you working on an Othello? Are you thinking about it?
I would love to. Right now I'm working on it.
Oh, good stuff. Yeah, but still lots of good questions there too. Good luck.
Thank you, and I hope that didn't. Okay, thanks. The next question: what were the cultural influences that had an impact on you when writing Hamlet 911? So I'm not sure if this is sort of like broad culture or in terms of like pieces of culture. But I guess you had the experience of working on it pre-pandemic and then doing sort of, making some changes to it during the pandemic. So what else were you drawing on, obviously, other than Hamlet itself?
I was drawing on my children's experience of and their friends, their sense of what's important to them, what they're excited about, what they look forward to, what they're worried about, their relationship with online life. That figured in it largely, because Jeremy does have a very involved life online. That was a big influence as well. I mean, the pandemic seemed to put into even greater relief Jeremy's isolation. We thought, oh, do we mention the pandemic? We do that? No, because he's already isolated. It's already about somebody in isolation. And then I would think the eruptions of the right-wing shift around the world was huge. The exposures brought to bear via Me Too, et cetera. Issues of EDI, which have been important in my life for a long time, becoming emergent as fully emerged socially visible issues. George Floyd, not that we don't have endless numbers of cases that we can point to here as well. Truth and reconciliation, the emergence of so much coming to light regarding residential schools, coming to a wider social consciousness, rather than just being something that people in progressive circles are grappling with. The Commission of Inquiry into Missing and Murdered Aboriginal Women and others. All of these things seem to be emerging along with a strange rightward lurch in the United States and elsewhere. And I thought, this is a time where there's great expansion and inclusion and awareness and potential for restitution and reconciliation, all at the same time as this other abreaction. And it seemed like a very, as my dad would put it, a very interesting time. Right? So I thought there's urgency, especially to be young in this time. I thought, if I were much younger, how would I be seeing these things? Where would my appetite be? What would I want to take on? Right? And I have to also remember that I'm older and I'm worried about these things, but if I were younger, I'd be worried about them in a different way. I'd be worried about them in a way that I go, that's where I'm going and that's what I'm going to do. So I have faith as well in that kind of energy, and what I'm hoping is the generations can partner, right? That we can continue to listen to each other and support each other through these interesting times. Yeah, that all was brought to bear on the rewrites, the generations, right? Mm-hmm. And it's beautiful. It's in so many land acknowledgements, and it is part of that worldview. Mm-hmm. The generations to come. What are we doing to look after our world and our hearts, mm-hmm. right?
I think that's the perfect note to end on today. So I'm going to ask, Julie's going to come up and just do the last bit of housekeeping. And I just want to say thank you to everyone for your great questions and for being here.
Thank you so much, Rachel. Thank you, Ann-Marie. As a parent of young teenagers, you are truly inspiring.
Oh, thank you.
I have a bit of a drama queen at home and a young boy, so anyhow. But we're virtual, so they can hear me talking, so it's great. Anyhow, but you are truly inspiring. Thank you so much for this today. I'm happy to let everyone know that Ann-Marie will be available in our beautiful Lazaretta's Hall Cafe to sign some books after this, after I stop talking. And And if you don't have your book yet, our theater store kiosk is also open, and so you can buy a book there. And we've talked so much about Hamlet 911. The box office is also open at 12 o'clock. So if you don't have your tickets for that, you should certainly go and get those. I wanted to thank everyone again. Thank you again for joining us today, and to quote Ann-Marie MacDonald, to leave us on a good note today: be true to your gifts. I think that's a great thing to say. Yeah. So thank you so much, everyone, for coming.
Thank you.